Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 275 of Humanity Rising. We continue our celebration of Unity Week that we commenced yesterday. All this week, Humanity Rising is collaborating with World Unity Week and hundreds of organizations all over the world that are coming together 24/7 for the entire week through this Saturday to celebrate humanity rising within the context of human unity. Today, we want to contemplate some of the challenges to unity. We want to talk about democracy globally, but particularly in the United States, which is under assault. And we want to have a dialogue with Robert Kennedy Jr., who I'll introduce momentarily, who has been really delving into the democratic implications of the pandemic and corporate imperatives emanating out of big pharma. So today we want to look at some of the complexities that are challenging all of us wherever we are in terms of our deep yearning to fashion a world in which we can harmonize all the diversity that we embody into a greater whole that is regenerative and abundant and in alignment with natural systems. Let us begin, as we always do, with a heart coherence meditation. Take just a moment now and center yourself in your body. Close your eyes and attune yourself to your heartbeat. See if you can feel your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you who are joining our session today, I want to say that Robert Kennedy has been delayed, and so will be joining us in just a little bit. He has a very complicated schedule these days. He's just trying to finish a book on the pandemic. So I thought a good way to both introduce the subject that he'll be considering, but also to give us an update, is to bring Shelley Alcorn, the Chief Operating Officer of Ubiquity University, who, as you know, since last fall, has been keeping us informed with an uncanny accuracy about the developments around the assault on democracy in the United States, a matter of deep national concern, but also global concern, because in countries all over the world, democracy as we know it is quite literally and intentionally under assault. And that is our world. So I want to welcome you, Shelley. You remember Shelley was here right around the inauguration talking to us and really predicted before it happened, the insurrection on January 6th. So Shelley has a deep awareness of the hidden currents that are operating right now. So Shelley, I turn the program over to you. And then when Robert joins us, we'll just naturally segue to him on the program. Shelley?
Well, hello, everyone. And I appreciate your patience with me filling in as the opening act for our main event, Robert Kennedy. And it is nice to be back to talk a little bit about following on conversations that happened in 2020. Where are we at right now in 2021? And it's quite fitting that unity should be sort of the theme for this week, because that is the thing that is missing the most in terms of our political discussion in the United States, and something that we absolutely need to grapple with. So let's get a little bit caught up, because the news isn't great. I hate being the one to always come on and say, oh, well, you know, things aren't as great as they seem. Even though things are quiet in the media, there are a lot of things happening behind the scenes that are a little disturbing, that we need to pay attention to. So as we were experiencing sort of a soft coup d'etat, we did end up with a hard coup d'etat and insurrection on January 6th. And we all know about that, and we know about the aftermath of that, which is still unfolding and is still ongoing. It feels like January 6th was like 5 years ago. And, you know, what do we even need to keep talking about this for? But there are a few important reasons for us to focus on it. And the one thing that is underlying all of this is the big lie. The big lie. It's a political weapon that's used by authoritarians and totalitarian systems, because big lies make all things possible. And the big lie was that the election was fraudulent and that Trump actually won the election. That was the big lie that started the day after the election and continued and continued and continued until it boiled over on January 6th with an attempt to stop the electoral process from happening and to literally decapitate the government by assassinating key leaders in the United States government. And the big lie is pernicious, and it's been used historically. This isn't a modern phenomenon. Big lies have been used in Rome. They were used in all manner of political systems. Some of the bigger examples we have are the big lie after World War I, that Germany would have won the war except for the Jews and except for the leftists. That was a big lie that fueled sort of the rise of Nazism and fascism in Germany. Viktor Orban in Hungary claims repeatedly and incorrectly that Middle Eastern refugees threaten to undermine their security. In a country of 10 million people, those refugees number about 1,000. So he's using that big lie to continue to consolidate power in Hungary. Vladimir Putin routinely lies to stoke fears for anti-Western propaganda inside Russia. As Peter Pomerantsev wrote, nothing is true and everything is possible. The big lie didn't stop January 6th. We had hoped that after January 6th that the Republicans would have been so shocked by the assault on their very person that they would abandon the big lie. And they did not. There are two responses to any type of event like an insurrection. One is a political response and one is a law enforcement response. We're going to talk about both of them very quickly. The political response has been unsuccessful so far. Let's just put it that way. There was an attempt to establish a bipartisan January 6th commission to investigate the roots, how it happened, what happened, to get to the bottom of that. Republicans in Congress have shot that down. They refused to pass in the Senate. votes for the commission. In fact, Mitch McConnell personally whipped members of the Senate to vote against establishment of a January 6th commission. In light of that fact, in light of the fact that there is difficulty getting the political response going, the House of Representatives is considering sort of 4 possibilities. One is to force a second vote in the Senate on the establishment of the commission. The second option is that Democrats in the House could create a select committee, and that poses political risks of Republicans appointing Trump water carriers such as Jim Jordan or Matt Gaetz and politicizing that committee, so it would be unable to do its function. A third option is that existing committees can continue their investigations, and a fourth option would be charging the House Homeland Security Committee with the investigation. If we cannot have a political investigation, if we cannot have a political commission, that is incredibly dangerous. That type of commission sets history. It documents the historical fact of the event. Without a commission like that, we're at the whim of media interpretation of that event or our own personal recollections and interpretations of that event, if there's no official political response. President Biden has said that he won't appoint a presidential commission to look into January 6th. They're taking political cover under that, saying he doesn't want to stoke, partisan divides. The actual real reason is that if he did, Congress would have to approve funding and subpoena power for that commission, and effectively that would be blocked in the Senate. So although they have political cover saying they don't want to have a partisan effort, really the bottom line is they can't get funding for it and they can't get subpoena power for it. So that avenue is also closed. So barring a political solution, and with the big lie continuing to be repeated and all of these things, we have the legal solution. And right now, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has arrested 480 individuals in connection with the January 6th insurrection, 53 of whom formerly served in the military and 12 of whom were police officers, either retired or current. They've said in court they plan to charge up to 550 people in total. They're investigating several members of Congress for aiding and abetting insurrectionists and participants in the attempted coup d'etat. 187 people have been indicted by grand juries so far in 45 states. Dozens of defendants have been linked to extremist groups. The average age of these participants is 41. And mostly male. Of the 480 people that they've arrested so far, 53 were women. By and large, though, the charges that are coming are trespassing, breaking and entering, violence, threats, et cetera, but they're not going so far as to say sedition or say insurrectionist charges. So they're really limiting in the legal arena the things that people are being charged for, riot-related charges, et cetera, which doesn't get to the heart of what it was that happened on January 6th. So the political response is being blocked, and the law enforcement response is somewhat insufficient in terms of establishing what it was that happened on January 6th. And why it's important to establish what it was is because now there are real world consequences of the big lie that are bypassing January 6th and going back into circulation. And there are consequences to this. Recent poll indicated that 53% of Republicans believe the 2020 election was stolen. 3% of Democrats believe it. A total of 25% of US citizens believe the election was stolen. That's 1 in 4 people in the United States. That is a huge amount of the population to believe something so fundamentally wrong and demonstrably proven to be wrong with fact. This has led to another consequence. False audits of election results are underway in different states, particularly key states. These auditors, quote unquote, are coming in with supposed backing from companies, and they're doing all sorts of stuff. And the political response, instead of using the Justice Department to shut these illegal audits down, because it's not legal to do this, Democrats are sort of relying on the facts will be shown after the audit. It's like, as if facts matter in the face of the big lie. The truth will out, they will count the votes, and they will get the same result. It's like, okay, you guys are ignoring the fact that there's only two reasons for these audits. One is to extend the big lie as long as possible to get us closer to the midterms in 2022, and lie about the outcome. So there we go. So that is also underway. And these false audits are being used as fodder for conspiracy theories that Trump will return to power in August, because these audits will show that the election results were actually for Trump and not for others. There's a third consequence of the big lie that's playing out in the political arena in the United States, and that's legislatively. And since January, 389 bills have been introduced in 48 states to limit voting rights. And more perniciously, to assert control over election boards by the ability to appoint political appointees to election boards, and to remove members of election boards that are perceived to not be producing the right results, which is absolutely dangerous. 14 states have enacted 22 new laws to restrict the access to vote, and 61 more of those bills are moving through 18 state legislatures, 31% or 31 of which have passed one house. Now there is a contrast. So let's contrast. 880 bills have been introduced for more expansive voting rights in 49 states, which is good. There is a pushback on this. 28 of them have been signed into law in 14 states, and we can take heart in that. But I want to remind everybody that those 14 states are not the 14 states that are actively they're not the usual suspects in terms of the Electoral College. Those are states that would have pursued those policies anyway. So the Electoral College is still a problem. And the For the People Act, there's an act in Congress right now to expand voting rights. It's actually coming up for a vote in the Senate today. I don't know what the result is going to be. There's a threatened filibuster on that. The For the People Act would expand access, which is good. It attempts to limit gerrymandering, which is good. It does, however, do nothing to prevent political efforts such as controlling electoral boards or attempting to remove electors or overturning elections in other ways. It is silent on that, which is unfortunate. So where does that leave us? Well, we are still in danger of an autocratic fascist takeover. Simply because the Democrats are in power now does not mean that we are out of the woods. And what I want to do now is delve, and I know I'm going really quickly, so I'm sorry. I'll look to see if there's questions in the chat, and Jim, I'm sure, can ask me questions. But we have to remember that historically, the battle in the United States over voting rights has been a battle over expansion of the vote. Historically, that is the way it's been. We started with voting only for the landed gentry. We made some expansions, women, people of color, but the question has always included a racial and gender stereotype. The question of expansion of the vote has always been racially and gendered stereotypes, and stereotyped around two general areas in the United States. One is the question of capacity. Are they smart enough to vote? Are they educated enough to vote? Should women vote if they vote against their husband's interests? That's always sort of been this capacity issue. And the second has been this question of fraud. How do we know these people are actually who they say they are? And you can trace this from the founding of the US all the way up to now with these questions about limiting fraud in US elections, which is a non-existent issue for the most part. And we have to look at the Civil War and the institution of Jim Crow laws to really understand where this expansion and where this fraud thing comes from. When Trump tells the big lie that Milwaukee and Atlanta and Philadelphia and Detroit, that those elections were fraudulent, it's really a dog whistle, right? And Republicans are still blowing the dog whistle. And they're doing it on a daily basis inside the United States. It's not getting enough play, to be honest, but it's still there. And what that leads us to is the question of timing. What's the timing of the next thing that is likely to happen? And these types of autocratic movements are very closely tied to public health. They're tied to our status. They're tied to income inequality. They're tied to a level of populism and a level of anger inside the United States. Our population is angry. They have little to no access to education, to healthcare, to basics of life, to financial security. And so all of the political inefficacy that's happening and all of sort of the legal avenues that don't seem to be happening, the anger inside the population is still being stoked around these things that are leading them towards these bad decisions that they made in 2016 and are likely to begin to make again in 2022. And one of the things that I look at when I talk about this is I look at the mass shootings in the United States. That's just a temperature gauge that you can use. And in the United States, since January 1 of 2021, we've had 272 mass shootings. And that total is 40% higher than 2020 and 65% higher than 2019. 8,700 Americans have died from gun violence. Mass shootings are defined as 4 or more people shot. And so this anger, this thing, this thing that's happening is leading us to the final point that I want to make today. And I can talk about how the Department of Justice is being absolutely horrible under Merrick Garland. There's a lot of things I could talk about what's not happening on the part of Democrats and Americans who are interested in the preservation of democracy, not just Democratic Party. I hate using those labels, but it is the label that we have. That in an autocratic attempt, it really is fueled by anger. It's fueled by anger on the part of the populace. And the populace is angry, and we want to try and tamp that down. We had an autocratic attempt by Trump. We had an autocratic breakthrough almost on January 6th. It did not succeed. An autocratic consolidation. And if we look at history, the autocrats don't take power in the first term, they take power in the second term. And those terms do not have to be contiguous. Hitler, between the beer hall putsch and his election, 13 years. Viktor Orban, 4 years. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party, 8 years. So they were in power, they lost power, and 4 to 8 to 13 years, they regained power because the movement didn't stop in the meantime. So the movement in the United States has not stopped. The legislative attempts to remove voting rights, to use political appointments, et cetera, are still underway. Trump is beginning his rallies again this summer. He's targeting Republicans who spoke out against the January 6th insurrection, or those who said there was no fraud in the election. At the CPAC convention in February, Trump repeated the big lie. Conspiracy theorists in the United States are beginning to stoke the idea that he will return to power in August of this year. Trump himself has been telling people he's going to return to power in August of this year. They're hanging their hats on the election audits that will conclude and will show he's rightfully elected. Again, the point is not to take power in August. The point is to extend the big lie to 2022. You have to watch what they say, but you have to watch what they do even more. And the Democrats are not doing the things they need to do to take the temperature of the American public down. Post-pandemic, they're not instituting expansions to healthcare. They're not raising the minimum wage. They're not canceling student debt. They're being stymied by members of their own party, like Manchin and Sinema. They have no response. Their response is feckless in certain ways. Because if you don't handle the anger, if you don't attempt to stop the big lie using political means or law enforcement means, you're seeding the conditions for this to happen again inside the US. And something else happened that I'm keeping my eye on, and I can talk about the DOJ. There's one other thing I want to bring to your attention. The Director of National Intelligence just released a domestic violent extremism report in March of 2021. Now, this is Biden administration, DNI. And yes, domestic violence extremism is bad. And I do not advocate for violence ever. That's just not the way we should be going about these things. But they have specifically carved out domestic violence extremist groups as some of those who oppose all forms of capitalism or corporate globalization and governing institutions. They've carved out domestic violence extremists who are seeking to end or mitigate perceived cruelty, harm, or exploitation of animals or destruction of natural resources and the environment. Now, they do say that mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, even strong rhetoric, doesn't rise to the level of domestic violent extremism. By carving out these exceptions for protest against capitalism, against environmental destruction, against climate change, et cetera, they're laying the groundwork, if an autocratic government comes in, to criminalize those activities as well. There's always consequences to something that you do that sounds good. We want to not target just right-wing extremists. We want to target left-wing extremists, but let's go so far as to define what those left-wing extremists believe. Well, they seem to be pro-environment and they seem to be anti-capitalist. Oh my God, people. It just sets the stage for bad things, for people to come in and change one line in that report. You can't set the stage. Democrats are setting the stage again. I'm trying to be dispassionate here. But it's been a long couple of years here. So, okay, so what can you do? If you're an American citizen or you're a citizen of the world and you're concerned about what's happening in America, here's a couple of things for you to do over the next few months, over the next few years as we're moving to 2022. Commit to the moral position of factuality. Facts are important. We have to have facts. We have to agree on a certain set of facts before we can have a discussion. Remember that freedom is not the expression of self-indulgence. Freedom is not the expression of self-indulgence. This whole mask debate in the United States, which is baffling the world, goes to a misunderstanding of freedom, which is interpreted in the United States not as solidarity, but as solitude. That my freedom is I can do whatever I want. And that is not actually freedom. That's self-indulgence. Pay attention to voting rights. Pay attention to what comes next. Pay attention to what's being prosecuted and what's not being prosecuted. Pay attention to what's being passed and what's not being passed. Commit yourselves to peace and tolerance, nonviolence, strong advocacy for just society, and in all cases, resist the urge to dehumanize political opponents, to dehumanize people, to dehumanize women, to dehumanize people of color, all of the things that we see, dehumanize LGBT people, to dehumanize the other, to dehumanize the immigrant, to dehumanize our fellow beings on this planet, and keep our eyes out for what's happening and what may happen next. So that's sort of a brief, kind of a brief overview of events since January 6th. And we need to understand that this is not over. The Department of Justice is actually standing in the way of some of these things taking effect under Merrick Garland. And we need to realize that for the people and by the people is under assault from all areas. So anyway, so thanks. If anyone has any questions, or in the chat, or Jim, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to expand a little further while we're waiting for Robert to join the call.
Yes, thank you, Shelley, and for everyone. Robert Kennedy has been delayed. He should be joining in the next 10, 15 minutes. He apologizes, but that's just life in the fast lane these days. So thank you all for your patience. He'll be with us shortly. And Shelley, thank you. You continue to illuminate these dark and complex events for all of us. And I think one of the threads in the chat has been how you ended with Merrick Garland, and I think the incredulity on the part of many of the members of the chat group, certainly myself, and you can see it on the news media, the incredulity that the Biden administration and in particular the Attorney General and the Justice Department seem to be silently colluding by their absence of action with something that's so obviously a threat to our democratic institutions. And I wonder if you could just explore that a little bit more deeply, because there's obviously historical antecedents to this. And it is part of how democracies fail. It is not only the putsch from the right, it's the silent collusion from the left. And speak more about it, because I think that issue, almost more than any other issue, is what has surprised people. And it seems to be deepening, not lessening.
Honestly, I'm very surprised by it too. I honestly believed that Merrick Garland would come in as Attorney General and that the Department of Justice would begin taking action to bring to light many of the things that occurred in the 4 years that we had just experienced. And that has not been the case. And let me give you a couple of concrete examples of actions the Department of Justice has taken that I think are running directly counter to our interests as citizens who profess to want to live in a democracy, but are sort of going off the rails. The Department of Justice is currently defending Jeff Sessions and Stephen Miller, who were the architects of the family separation policy, from lawsuits seeking damages for harm caused by family separation at the border. Policies that they created and they advocated for. The Department of Justice is actively defending them. The positions that the Department of Justice takes always sounds like, oh, well, that's kind of reasonable. I guess you shouldn't be able to prosecute people for things the prior administration did. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who played a direct role in causing harm, kidnapping, torture, and family separation at the border. The Department of Justice is defending them. The Department of Justice is fighting release of documents related to the Trump Hotel in DC and their relationship with the General Services Administration and the amount of income that came in from foreign interests into Trump DC while Trump was president. DOJ is actively resisting that. The DOJ is actively resisting fighting release of Trump's tax returns. They're actively resisting release of those tax returns. I'm just, the Department of Justice is currently defying Judge Amy Berman Jackson's request to release a memo that Bill Barr received following Robert Mueller's report on Russian interference and the actions that Bill Barr took after that, subsequent to that. And it's just, worst of all, these are the top two things that have just got me on fire. They're continuing to defend Trump against a defamation suit brought by E. Jean Carroll, who has accused Trump of sexual assault. And they're defending Trump because they believe they're protecting the executive branch from inquiry in the future. Their stated reason is they're defending Biden or other presidents in the future from having to defend against defamation suits or other lawsuits of the type while they're in office. So they're continuing to fight E. Jean Carroll and her attempt to hold Trump accountable for the defamation that he launched against her in light of her case. And they're also refusing to release information on Department of Justice efforts to spy on Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee in 2020 or during the Trump administration. They're actively fighting the release of those documents of their own nefarious activities that they got up to while they were being run by people who did not have the United States citizens' best interests at heart. This absolutely undermines and protects the things that happened. And what it does is it disillusions the American public that anyone is looking out for them, that justice will be served, that they aren't, that the system isn't completely broken beyond repair, and therefore it's not worth saving. So whatever comes next is just what happens. That is how autocracy takes hold. And that's how it keeps hold, is when faith in institutions is undermined to the point where the alternative gives you nothing to fight for. And that's what's going on right now in the Department of Justice. I am highly disappointed in what I'm seeing, and I am not surprised. I wish I was surprised, but I'm not surprised that these actions are being taken to defend the indefensible from the light of justice and from the light of accountability and responsibility, which historians and political scientists are screaming for, is documentation of accountability in the post-Trump era, which we are not in, by the way. It is not the post-Trump era. It is in the intermission of the play. Even if Trump were to have a heart attack tomorrow, the forces that pushed this, and the Josh Hawleys and the Ted Cruzes and all of the Republicans that were continuing to push the big lie, it will continue. Trump is the one that lit the match, but the effort is still underway. And the use of institutions like this to stop accountability for what happened will seed the ground for worse things to happen in the future. So yeah, so the DOJ, I don't know what they're doing right now. I don't know what they're doing. And I don't know how to hold them accountable for what it is that they're doing at the moment. But that's concrete examples of how they're undermining any attempt to account for not only January 6th, but to account for the 4 years that preceded it. And, you know, you could argue the 8 years preceding that and the 40 years since Reagan, because let's remember, these things don't happen in a vacuum. These things are systematic, they're planned, and they're executed. And it's no accident that Black Lives Matter is still front and center in this whole political milieu, because the white supremacist undertones are so stark inside all of the things that are happening in the United States. So yeah, I don't know if that helped. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, very much so, because the question was around the failure of the progressive political forces
Yeah.
To either confront or to rectify. And I think that what Shelley's saying, everyone, just to underscore, there's two sides of this coin. The fundamental first side is to hold accountable the violation of law while in office. And that is what the Biden administration is not doing. The other side of that coin is to confront the ongoing subterfuge through getting the voting rights bill through challenging, like, for example, in Arizona, the recount is in fact illegal, and the Justice Department is not doing anything about it. So there's these two aspects of accountability and rectification of the situation, such that the country can move forward, remembering in documented ways, like with Nuremberg. Just imagine the end of the Second World War without Nuremberg. It was the fact that we held the Nazi leadership accountable that forever enshrined the greatest crime in the history of the world. Had Nuremberg not happened, and there were many people among the Allies, certainly in Germany, that worked hard to not get it to happen. But in the end, that notion of the accountability before history is a fundamental act after any crime to certify its criminality. And right now, with Trump and the big lie and the voter suppression, there isn't that announcement and documentation around accountability. So what Shelley's saying, I think, could not be more important. And I think, Shelley, it'd be very interesting for you to say a little bit more about the Arizona election, because it's not only in Washington, but it's in states all across the country where this subversion, including not only the limitation of voting, but giving the legislatures, and in some cases the courts, the right to overthrow democratic elections if they don't turn out to serve the interests of the people and party in power.
Yeah, apparently the ones who tried it and weren't able to legally get away with it in 2020, well, they're trying to fix that. They're blatantly introducing all manner of bills to appoint alternative electors and overthrow the results if they don't like it, or set up their own electoral commissions, or. And in Arizona in particular, it's sort of a lightning rod, but it's not limited to Arizona, this so-called audit that they've started. You know, backed by the cyber ninjas firm. They have counters who've gone in and they're recounting the votes. This isn't done. There was no evidence of fraud. The court said over and over and over that the election in Arizona was valid. Even some Arizona Republicans were saying, no, the election was valid. This is valid. The fact that they not only are allowing these people to not be observed, there's no observers in there. In regular elections, there are observers who are allowed to observe. There's no observers. There's no political accountability. There's no purpose other than to extend and or attempt to contribute to the big lie. And nothing is being done about it. There seems to be this fear. And here's the other weapon of autocracy, fear. There's fear on both sides. The fear on the part of not Democrats, anyone in America who believes in voting should be appalled by what's going on. This is not a partisan issue. This is a voting issue. They should be appalled that simply because you didn't like the results, you don't get the right to send in your own people to be unobserved, to conduct an illegal review of votes, and to come up with your own counts. That it's insanity that this is being allowed to happen in complete contravention to the law. We don't do that in America. We have recounts. We had recounts. We had recounts in Arizona. We had recounts all over after the 2020 election. Recounts are fine. This is not a recount. This is not a recount. This is an attempt to rewrite history. And it's not being dealt with in a legal way or a political way. It's just being allowed to play out. And it's stoking fear on the part of everyone who doesn't want to seem to be the ones who put the kibosh on it. This shouldn't be a question. This shouldn't be a thing. This should be shut down. This should be shut down. And it is not being shut down. And in an attempt to make it look fair, and by the way, it's been going on for months now, okay? They had a Republican delegation of Washington state lawmakers tour the facility as a way to say, look, we're being open, we're being observed. No, they're allowing Republican delegations who have a stake in the outcome to tour the facility and certify that everything's fine. That's good Lord. Well, hello, Mr. Fox. How the chickens doing? Oh, the chickens are doing great. There's eggs all over the place in here. That is just not at all what should be happening. And again, the political response and the legal response are being completely ineffective when dealing with this issue. And it's sad. It's sad.
Shelley, let's talk a moment about what's happening in the Southern District of New York in their investigation of the Trump organization and the Trump tax returns, and what's also happening in the state of Georgia with the new attorney general there who's investigating Trump and colleagues for obstruction of justice. Bring us up to date on those two investigations, because
Sure.
those might offer some hope of some kind of accountability.
For sure, for sure. So I'll tackle SDNY first, and then we'll move to Georgia. So the Southern District of New York is often called the Sovereign District of New York, and they have a high degree of independence as federal attorneys. And they have recently convened a grand jury to look at the evidence to indict Donald Trump and the Trump organization for all manner of crimes: embezzlement, fraud, foreign dealings, the 501c3, the nonprofit that they ran that was funneling money to the campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that SDNY convened a grand jury means they are very confident that they have the evidence they need to actually indict Trump on some of the charges that have been levied against him. Not for presidential misconduct, but for his personal financial dealings. And they've interviewed a ton of people in the Trump orbit, including Alan Weisselberg, who was his CFO for many, many years. So they have a lot of evidence. It's going to be interesting to see what the grand jury does with that and whether they issue an indictment for Trump and or members of the Trump organization, including his family and including his employees. So that's one track. And the fact that they're serious enough to convene a grand jury means SDNY probably has what they need. They wouldn't go after a fish that big unless they had the things that they needed to go after it. So I think there's some hope there that perhaps Trump will be indicted. Now, what is that going to mean? That's going to mean, who knows? Is that going to be plea deals? Is that going to be just a fight in courts and then appeals courts and then How long could that extend before he was removed from the political scene? That's an open question. That's an open question. But there is hope there. Again, it won't stop the movement entirely, but it would stop Trump from being a lightning rod for this. So the fact that SDNY, and I'm going to say probably behind the scenes, and I don't know this, but I'm hoping the DOJ is not pressuring SDNY like the Trump administration pressured SDNY to leave Trump alone. I'm really hoping that's not there. Second, in Georgia, let's hope that we can.
Shelley?
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Oh, Georgia, yes. Let's hope that we can have some accountability in Georgia for a crime committed to pressure Georgia to deliver votes, which is actually a crime as well. So we'll hope for those two things and that outcome. And I'm so glad that my act is over and we can welcome the main guest. But thanks everyone for listening to my little democracy lesson this morning, and enjoy the rest of your program.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you so much. These issues, and welcome, Bob. I've previously introduced you to the program. And we've been talking, as we've been waiting for your appearance, about the threat to democracy in America. And we'll be talking about your forthcoming book and some of the issues around the pandemic and the vaccines in a moment. But as we welcome you to the program, you know, as someone who's been a political observer probably most of your life and deeply cares about democracy in America, I think all of us would be very interested in just hearing from you your assessment of what is currently taking place. You know, I'm thinking here of, you know, the big lie coming from Donald Trump, the insurrection on January 6th, the consolidation of the Republican Party around voter suppression, the seeming unwillingness or inability of the Justice Department to take any realistic countermeasures. How are you viewing what's going on right now? And welcome to Humanity Rising. Welcome.
And thank you for having me. I'm sorry that we were late. We were having technical problems here. Yeah, I mean, I think it's the most disturbing thing that I've seen, which is this this obliteration of all the institutions, you know, the extreme polarization, and all of the institutions of democracy, but also, you know, the values, you know, that really distinguished and defined our country all of just the destruction of constitutional rights in the last year, and not only what's happening with the Justice Department and what happened on January 6th, but which is, I think, a symptom of the total disillusionment of the American people with institutions, and particularly with the press. On the left, people look at people on the right and they think that they're crazy. They think, why aren't they wearing masks? The science says they should wear masks. Why aren't they embracing vaccination? Why aren't they doing what they're told with the lockdowns? And on the right, people look at CNN and just the lies that are, and the ascendancy of this medical cartel and the corrosion of our institutions, and particularly the press, by the pharmaceutical industry. All of these major trustworthy authorities really become subsumed in this orthodoxy, and nobody's doing critical thinking anymore. It's like critical thinking has been abolished, and that really was the common ground that we all had in this country. And, that democracy is a product of critical thinking. It's an escape from orthodoxy, and all of us our hard orthodoxies are hardwired into our genetic programming. From spending during the 20,000 generations that humanity spent wandering the African savanna, following a strong leader that was critical of our survival, looking at anybody that was outside of our little group as enemies, outside of our tribe as enemies, binding each other with similar cosmologies and belief systems, and then allowing us to dismiss anything good that people do outside of to be blind to reason, to rationale. And you see that kind of tribalism rising now, and really the Reformation, all of the things that laid the groundwork for democracy, Renaissance, and all of the kind of the opening of the human mind, where people started saying, we're not going to get truth from appeals to authority anymore. We're going to find truth in appeals to reason, and we are going to put principles ahead of personalities, and we're going to govern ourselves. We're going to do this experiment in self-governance, which really relies on reason and critical thinking, and free speech, and the testing of ideas in the cauldron of debate, and having places and forums for civil debate, for all the policies that we rely on, and that get tested in the market of debate. And that's now been abolished. The First Amendment to the Constitution is gone. We have a press that is enforcing orthodoxies. We have government agencies and a large industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and combined with military and intelligence apparatus, flooding America with propaganda. We have the press not distinguishing propaganda from truth. We have, once they abolished the First Amendment, the reason that freedom of press, freedom of speech is in the First Amendment is because all the other freedoms and liberties are dependent upon it. If you can get rid of free debate, you can get away with anything. And the religious freedoms quickly followed. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that for a year we closed churches in the country. The government ordered churches closed and ordered liquor stores remain open as essential businesses. And You know, there's nothing about liquor stores in the Constitution. There's a lot in the Constitution that says you can't do that to churches. And then we abolish private property rights. Extraordinary that the government would step in and say all property has to be closed. There's no due process. Every business in our country has to be shut down. There's no due process. There's no compensation for takings. The property was taken, and that's unconstitutional. We abolished jury trials, the Sixth and Seventh Amendment, by saying anybody who claims that they're engaged in a countermeasure, you can't sue them. A pharmaceutical company that's making remdesivir and lying about it, or vaccines and lying about it, no matter how reckless they are, no matter how negligent they are, no matter how toxic their ingredients, irresponsible their manufacturing processes, no matter how grievous your injury or death, you cannot sue them. We have a government that is systematically lying to us, from the beginning, exaggerating the projections about deaths, telling us 22 million Americans were going to die in order to justify those lockdowns, and telling us that masks work when Tony Fauci's own website on NIH had 22 studies on it, all of them saying that they don't work. And listen, if somebody shows me science and goes through a regulatory process where we can test those assertions, I'm the first person to put on a mask, but I don't want to be told what to do. And that's, all of these people with no reason. I don't want to be told the science supports this. And I'm reading the science myself and finding zero support for it and overwhelming support against it. I want to be able to cross-examine the guy who says that in an administrative hearing. I want a notice and comment period. I want the government to publish proposed rules, accept comments on them, and be able to read those comments publicly, and then have a public hearing where they do an environmental impact statement, a regulatory impact statement, an economic impact statement, and it says, here's how many people are going to die from the lockdown. Here's how we expect the lockdown to work. Here's the science that tells us that the lockdown is the best thing to do. And here's the number of people who are going to die, the cost of the lockdown to the American economy over the generations, the cost to our values. This is what an environmental impact statement is supposed to be done. None of that was done. There was one doctor who never treated a COVID patient, who does not read science, apparently, who got up there and in March said masks don't work. 2 months later say, masks work, strap it on. A month after that, put 2 of them on. No science, no regulatory process, no due process, no requirement by CNN. Tony Fauci, you changed your mind. Show us the scientific study that made you do that. Show us the science. Did you ever assess the number of people who will die from lockdowns? There's really good science on that. There was a whole cottage industry that popped up in the economic space during the 1980s. When there was giant downsizing in American corporations, and there was an economic a specialty that emerged at that time of studying what the impacts of unemployment on human health and mortalities. And there's a key study that has been cited thousands of times that came out in 1982 that said for every 1 point in unemployment, you get 37,000 excess deaths in America. You get 4,000 excess imprisonments. You get 3,300 excess admissions to mental institutions. They break down the deaths. 9,000 of those deaths are from heart attacks. There's deaths from suicide. There's deaths from accidental deaths that are probably due to depression. There's deaths from people losing their health insurance, and they're all broken down. We drive up unemployment by 20% or 30%. Are we killing more people with lockdowns than COVID killed? Why are we lied about the PCR test? Why did they change the calculation for how coroners are supposed to list deaths from COVID? And only COVID, nothing else. Oh, that if you get a COVID test and 60 days later, they're positive COVID test, which does not mean that you're sick, by the way. And 60 days later, you die in a car accident, your death is listed as a COVID death. We're not given clarity. There's a deliberate effort by government officials to obfuscate, to conceal, to hide. And these institutions have lost credibility. And I think Americans on both sides, on one side are saying, we believe everything that the medical technocrats tell us and we need to behave, which I understand that impulse. And on the other side, there are people who say, we don't trust these people. They're demonstrating day after day that they're lying to us. And we're not going to do what they tell us to do because we don't believe them. I think it's really, it's a sad thing for democracy. And I read Orwell and Aldous Huxley and Kafka and all of these, these dystopian, science fiction nightmare novels when I was a kid. And you think, yeah, that probably will happen at some point, but not in my lifetime. But here we are.
Well, thank you. And I think what you've done, Bob, is you've expanded the scope of the challenge to democracy. It's not just about the election and voter suppression that we're dealing with. We're dealing with in some ways, the collusion between the corporations and the governmental civic institutions around an agenda that serves profit and power, not public health. And the pandemic has been, in some ways, a perfect storm for all the things that you're bringing to our attention. And one question I think everyone would be interested in hearing you contemplate, given what you know, if you had to tell the story of the rise of the COVID pandemic and the government responses around lockdown and masks and social distancing, et cetera, what's your origin story? How do you think this thing unfolded in the way that it has? The storyline is that this pandemic burst out and governments just simply reacted spontaneously in the moment as best that they could in a tight time frame in which actions needed to be taken to stop the pandemic. Now, how would you tell the story?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a couple of ways to tell it. One is, governments and people in power love pandemics, the same reason that they love wars. There are opportunities of convenience to increase authoritarian controls and to shift wealth upward, which is exactly what's happening here. And then silence protests of that through censorship and through, expanded police state powers. And Naomi Klein, wrote this book about disaster capitalism that outlines this process precisely. So even if you believe that the pandemic was completely a natural phenomena, you can still be mistrustful and uncomfortable with the way the government is handling it. The other thing, and I outline this on my book on Fauci, is that the people in the medical cartel, which are, and I'm going to put this, government authorities, the pharmaceutical industry, some PR groups, the intelligence apparatus, have been planning this response for years. And the reason that we know that, we have many, many pieces of evidence for that. But one of the most eloquent pieces of evidence is if you look at the simulations that were done, where a lot of them sponsored by Bill Gates, beginning around 1998, by the intelligence community and by that whole combination of the pharmaceutical industry, planning the appropriate response for a pandemic. And what they were practicing, if you read them, which is Event 201 and Clade 6 and Crimson Contagion in 2019, and Event 201, which was, October of 2019, when the virus was already circulating, which was Bill Gates's. And people know a lot about that. The SPARS is another one. Dark Winter is another one. And these were done by the American military, by the CIA, and by the pharmaceutical industry. And they were done every year, every 2 years, beginning around 1998. And they include the press, all of the major press players like the New York Times or the Washington Post. And each time they reenact a pandemic, some of them last 4 or 5 days. And they're very, very realistic. People spend millions of dollars creating these simulations, and they're teaching people, they're training public officials and training the press that the appropriate response to a pandemic is authoritarian controls and a vaccine at the end. None of them talk about developing therapeutic drugs. None of them talk about preserving the Constitution during the pandemic. There is no pandemic exception in the US Constitution. There's nothing in the United States Constitution. And, by the way, George Washington and the founders were very familiar with pandemics. There was a smallpox pandemic during the Revolutionary War, and it played a key role. So they knew that pandemics were very, very disruptive of government, and yet they did not put anything in the Constitution that says the rules will change and the Constitution will be obliterated when we have our pandemic. These people, beginning in 1998, were practicing and doing. You know what the Milgram Experiment was? The Milgram Experiment was a experiment that was done that's been integrated into kind of psychological warfare planning by all of the intelligence agencies around the world. And that experiment was done by a guy called a Yale professor named Stanley Milgram, who he recruited volunteers from every walk of life, put them in a room and had them administer electric shocks to somebody in the other room who was actually an actor, who was pretending that they were being shocked. And the people who were just normal Americans who were administering the shocks were being ordered to do that by figures in authority, by men in white lab coats. And what the Milgram Experience showed, it's called the obedience experiment, that people, virtually anybody, if they can be made to do things that are against their conscience, that are against all of their values. These are virtually everybody, the 300 people in that experiment, turn the electric dial up to near fatal rates. And because somebody in a white lab coat was telling them to do it. And the intelligence agencies have integrated that lesson into their, to their psychological warfare techniques. And these simulations were an integration of that medicine. They were training exercises for high-level public officials, many of them people who are now running the pandemic response, all went through these most of them went through these training exercises. And they were told again and again and again, year after year, when there's a pandemic, you have to abolish constitutional rights. You have to impose censorship. You have to lie to the public with propaganda. You have to target certain communities, Black communities, et cetera, for who are naturally vaccine hesitant. We have to have separate strategies with them. And that we have to abolish choice. We should not be looking at therapeutic drugs. We need to put people on lockdown, put them essentially under house arrest in a kind of what is a global hostage taking to inspire a kind of mass psychosis that is known in the psychological warfare literature as Stockholm syndrome, where the captives become grateful to their captors, where they become totally obedient, where they see their captors as their only hope for salvation and safety. And they do whatever they're told without question. And it's a way specifically to abolish critical thinking. And these guys were practicing this, for years and years and years. And Bill Gates funded a lot of those and participated in them. And we had, if you want to go back in time, and I sort of, go back, well, I go all the way back to the Atlantic Charter, but around 1998, or 1988, the Soviet Union collapsed. And when I was a boy in January 17th, 1961, Dwight Eisenhower gave his greatest speech ever, and one of the most important speeches in American history, and you know what I'm talking about, where he warned America that we are about to lose our democracy because of the growth of the military-industrial complex. And this was a week before my uncle took office. It was Eisenhower's last speech.
Yes.
And my uncle then spent 3 years taking that very seriously, challenging, at odds the entire time he was in office with his intelligence agencies, with the CIA. He fired the top 3 guys in the CIA and with the Pentagon brass, who were telling him, you got to go into Laos. He refused. You got to go send combat troops into Vietnam. He refused. And he was killed in 1963. 6 months later, Vietnam had turned into an American war. And my father then ran against that war in 1968, was also killed. The military-industrial complex won the battle and began hollowing out the middle class in our country. It was 50% of our budget going to military expenditures. And then in 1988, the wall collapses. And you remember, we were promised a peace dividend, and all that money that we were spending on, a $1 billion stealth bomber that cannot fly in the rain. And all of that money was now going to be brought home, and we're invested in schools and highways and police protection, and we were going to make America what it was always meant to be. After this Cold War hiatus, the city on the hill, the gleaming alabaster monument to self-governance and humanity. But there were people within our society who heard about the peace dividend and said, wait a minute, that's coming out of our pockets, the whole military-industrial complex. Oh, they needed an enemy, and they needed a permanent enemy that would not let us down like the Soviets had by folding their tents. And, terrorism, 4.5 years later, the first World Trade Center bombing occurred, and all that money that was headed for the peace dividend suddenly put the screeching brakes on. And in 9/11, we had the World Trade Center bombing, and you had, at that point, Islamic terrorism becomes, the new Soviet Union. And Dick Cheney says it's a long war. It's going to last generations. It's going to be in 50 countries around the world. And all these people are licking their chops. Well, and all that money is now being poured into homeland security. The problem with terrorism is it's really not dangerous if you live in the United States. You know, Islamic terrorism after 9/11 was killing fewer people than lightning every year. And most people in Dubuque or, Akron or whatever were not real, or Birmingham, were not really being affected by it. But from the beginning, those same military planners understood that there's something bigger, a better enemy than terrorism, an enemy that can get into everybody's home and kill Americans wantonly, and that is bugs, germs. And if you remember in 9/11, 2 weeks after 9/11, there was anthrax attacks.
Mm.
The anthrax attacks were blamed on Saddam Hussein, and they justified us. Judith Miller, for the New York Times, and everybody said we got to go to war against Iraq because we knew Afghanistan was responsible for the World Trade Center. That's where Osama bin Laden. He'd never been to Iraq, but the anthrax attack justified our war on Iraq. And it turned out a year later, when the FBI did an investigation, that the anthrax had come from one of 3 U.S. military installations. They dropped their investigation and never figured out who actually sent it. But it was from the U.S. military. And at that point, the biosecurity agenda begins eclipsing the war on terrorism as the spear tip of American foreign policy. Huge amounts of money start going into biosecurity, and most of that money is captured by, or large amounts of it, by Tony Fauci. And one of the things that Tony Fauci did is we had germ warfare capability in this country beginning in 1943. The program was run by George Merck, who was simultaneously running Merck, the pharmaceutical company, and by the CIA. And in 1969, Richard Nixon shut down our entire biosecurity. And there were thousands of Pentagon people and scientists, 4,000 of them who were working in US labs developing bioweapons. By that time, according to the head of the commander of the bioweapons program, David France, we had developed bioweapons with what he called nuclear equivalents. In other words, something that could kill the same amount of people as a nuclear bomb. Nixon shut it all down. Those people were fighting ever since then. That was 1969 through 1973. It was all shut down. And they were trying to get back. We signed the Geneva Convention on Bioterrorism, which we helped write, or biosecurity, so we could not, or bioweapons, so we can no longer develop or stockpile them. It was a loophole. And the loophole was you could develop vaccines. Well, there are techniques for developing vaccines as a defense to bioweapon attacks. There's a certain technique for developing vaccines. It's not the technique that other vaccines are developed by. There are certain techniques called accelerated evolution, and then, actually the transfers of genetic material through CRISPR technology that are what they call dual use. In other words, the same techniques that you use for developing the vaccine are identical to the techniques that you use for developing weapons. And the military began pouring huge amounts of money into vaccine research as a hiding place to develop bioweapons. And Tony Fauci wanted to capture that funding stream for himself. And he did that successfully. His bioweapons budget from the military went from $0 in 2002, or 2001 to about 1.6 billion in 2003. And so Tony Fauci has a $6.1 billion annual budget, which he misuses. He's made his agency an incubator for pharmaceutical products. It no longer does research. He also gets $1.6 billion from the military, from BARDA, from DARPA. And that money, the way he justifies that money is he's developing these bioweapons defense vaccines. And it's very, very dangerous because you're deliberately developing organisms through gain of function research, that you're taking innocuous organisms and turn them into pandemic pathogens by increasing their transmissibility, by increasing their pathogenicity, their virulence, their deadliness to human beings. That is the endpoint. That's what you're trying to do. And so a bunch of his organisms escaped from US labs, from his and some of the militaries, because the PREDICT program, which is done by USAID, which is a CIA front, is doing the same thing, and the Pentagon is doing the same thing. And they're all competing with each other. And a bunch of those organisms escaped in 2014, and 300 scientists signed a petition to Obama asking Obama to shut down Tony Fauci's labs and these experiments, and saying to Obama, these are so dangerous, one of his little germs is going to escape. It's going to be Pandora's box. And there's no benefit coming from these to humanity. There's no benefit for vaccines, none. And so Obama shut it down and called a moratorium. Tony Fauci shut down about 21 of his studies, but he kept the worst ones going essentially secretly. His funding to Ralph Barrick on some of the really bad studies at the University of North Carolina. And then he took his funding and he moved it to Wuhan, China, where he would be out of sight of nosy White House, oversight. And he began funding these scientists at, in a lab that's associated with the Chinese military, and a lab that was shoddily built. Incidentally, it was built by a French company called Biomiro, and they were required as part of their contract to put a negative airflow, a state-of-the-art negative airflow system, which is critical infrastructure for a BSL-4 lab. And they didn't do it. And the CEO of that company is a man named Stefan Bonzel, who today is the CEO of Moderna, which is the company that has profited most from this pandemic. And in that lab, they were developing germs that were, from bats. The bats were 1,000 miles away. This idea that it had come from the Wuhan wet market was always a joke. Everybody knew that wasn't true. And they had the largest collection of bad coronaviruses on Earth in that lab. And they were doing experiments with them to make them more pathogenic and more virulent and more transmissible. And it's clear now that one of those almost certainly escaped from that lab. And the evidence for that is mountainous. It is virtually irrefutable. And so, my guess is that it escaped accidentally, but it's like Tony Fauci and Bill Gates had all of these very prescient predictions that a coronavirus is going to hit any moment. He predicted it virtually to the day 2 years before at a World Economic Forum conference. Both of them were saying it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. It's going to come during the Trump administration. And, I don't think they deliberately, I'm quite sure nobody deliberately released it, but I think they were doing something that they knew was so reckless and so dangerous that it was dead certain that one of these viruses at one of their little places was going to escape their little shop of horrors. And by the way, one of the things, the big assumption that everybody has that they've tried to inculcate, as part of their orthodoxy, is that pandemics are inevitable. That one was coming no matter what. That a virus would make that leap, animals to humans, and it was going to devastate humanity the same way that the Spanish flu did in 1918. And this is told to us again and again and again so that it becomes part of the orthodoxy. The truth is there's no scientific basis for that. Tony Fauci himself in 2008 did an article for The Lancet that showed where he admitted that the 50 million people who died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 2018 did not die of the flu. They died of bacterial meningitis and bacterial pneumonia. And today, all of that would be curable in 4 or 5 days with a course of antibiotics like penicillin, which did not exist back then. And in fact, pandemics, particularly in wealthy countries, disappeared altogether around the beginning of the century. It had nothing to do with vaccines. Puerperal fever, cholera, scarlet fever, which never had a vaccine, tuberculosis, all of the major diphtheria, tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, measles. Measles had disappeared. Measles mortalities had virtually disappeared before the vaccine was introduced in 1963. Measles killed a lot of people when America was a poor country. So the CDC did a major study with Johns Hopkins in 2010. The study is called GUYER, G-U-Y-E-R, and it's one of many studies that say the same thing. And that study looked at why did infectious disease mortalities disappear in the 20th century? She killed millions of people in the 19th century. Why did they suddenly disappear? And what CDC found out was that it had nothing to do with vaccines, and it had everything to do with nutrition, with clean water, chlorination, electric refrigerators, roads that could bring, and transport systems that could bring oranges from Florida, and just better. And it happened in all the nations that had good nutrition. It had nothing to do with medicine. There's another famous study that was required reading in every medical school in the country called McGinley and McGinley in the 1970s. And it actually calculated the contribution of all medical interventions, including surgeries and antibiotics, to the disappearance in disease mortalities. And they, the McGinleys, which is a seminal study, said that all mortality is probably less than 1% of the disappearance of infectious disease mortalities had to do with all medical interventions, including antibiotics, including surgeries, including vaccines. And what McGinley said, it wasn't the doctors that abolished disease mortalities, although they want to take credit for it. They warned Americans the medical cartel is going to try to take credit for this. They had nothing to do with it. It was the engineers. It was the people who built our refrigerators, our roads, our heating and lighting systems. And so this idea that Gates and Fauci have been promoting that these global, and by the way, those nutrition does not abolish disease. Some diseases it does, like scurvy, cholera, and several others. But it abolishes mortality. So kids were still getting measles in 1963. But the death rate was 1 in 500,000. And when scientists and researchers have looked at who was dying, the 400 kids that were dying annually were almost all Black kids. They were from the Mississippi Delta. They were badly malnourished, and a lot of them had intellectual disabilities. This was before the war on poverty, and before my father visited the Mississippi Delta and created the WICS program and said, we got to abolish hunger and food stamps. And so, measles mortalities almost certainly would have disappeared altogether on there, because when those kids started getting service, they would have probably disappeared altogether. But, we introduced the vaccine in 1963, and it's had all kinds of very detrimental effects on American society. And there's no reason to believe that it's actually had any impact on mortalities. It prevents people from getting measles. But there's a lot of reasons that you would want to get measles. There are many, many, many studies that show that children who get measles have much more robust immune systems that are not only lower the risk of atopic disease, of allergic diseases, of cardiac diseases, but also of cancers, of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, ovarian cancer. There's study after study that show that kids who get wild measles and wild chicken poxes as children are much less likely to get cancers when they get older. There's a Japanese study, which we have on our website, that actually shows graph lines of people who got mumps, measles, and chicken pox as children, and compares, and people who did not, and shows that the people who got all three of those diseases, natural infections, have about 10 longer years of life. And after 30 years, have lived 10 years longer than people who did not get any of those diseases. There's a lot of paradoxical and ambiguous information that we're not debating, that people, that we ought to be debating. We ought to have open debate about this, but unfortunately, you're not allowed to talk about it. This information does not get out to the public, and the people that you see on TV who are the so-called medical authorities, the Peter Hotez, the Art Kaplan, the Paul Offit, these are all people who are taking money from Bill Gates and Tony Fauci. They are what they call PIs, principal investigators. They're economic, virtually every one of them. And all the people who sit on those committees at FDA and CDC that approve new drugs, they're all financial beneficiaries of the pharmaceutical industry, virtually all of them, of Tony Fauci or Bill Gates. What Tony Fauci has done to that agency is supposed to tell us where are the chronic diseases coming from. Why are we having this epidemic of chronic disease? When Tony Fauci came to NIAID in 1968, the rate of chronic disease in our country was around 6%. By chronic disease, I mean autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, lupus, neurodevelopmental diseases like ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, autism, and allergic diseases like peanut allergies, asthma, eczema. Those diseases basically did not exist or were unknown or extremely, extremely rare prior to 1989. By 1986, the chronic disease had doubled. It's gone from 6% to 11.8%. It's under Tony Fauci's watch. Today, it's at 54%. Our children are the most vaccinated children in the world, and they're the sickest. And Tony Fauci, the work he's supposed to be doing, which is to tell us why has autism gone from 1 in 10,000 kids when I was a child, 1 in 10,000 Americans in my generation today, 1 in 10,000 has full-blown autism. In my children's CDC's numbers just came out this week in New Jersey, more than 1 out of 10, 12% of boys now has autism. How did that happen? How did you go from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 10? How did that happen? Tony Fauci's job is to tell us that. It has to be an environmental toxin. We know it. Genes don't cause epidemics. They can provide a vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. And there's a limited number of things that happen at night. Congress instructed EPA to tell us where did the autism epidemic come from. EPA came back. What year did it start? That's what Congress asked EPA. EPA scientists came back and said it had 1989. It's a red line. What happened in 1989? What happened? It's easy to figure out. There's a limited number of culprits. There's glyphosate pesticides, neonicotinoid pesticides, the vaccine schedule, which exploded that year with aluminum and mercury and all these other toxins in vaccine. And by the way, all of those injuries, those chronic disease that I listed for you, they're all listed as vaccine side effects on the manufacturer's inserts or the 72 vaccine doses that are now mandated for our children since 1989. I had 3 vaccines when I was a kid. Today's kids get 72 doses of 16 vaccines, and those injuries, those chronic diseases are all listed as side effect. It could be wireless phones, telephones. It could be ultrasound. There's a limited number of things that it could be of exposures. Tony Fauci's job is to tell us which one of those it is, but that's not what he does. What he does, he takes that entire $7.6 billion budget and he spends it on developing new drugs for the pharmaceutical industry. And what the specific thing that he does is in his laboratory, he has thousands of petri dishes filled with viral diseases like coronavirus. And his scientists put a molecule on those diseases in that petri dish. And they see if they try to find a molecule that will kill those coronaviruses. And when they find one that will kill them all, and they take that molecule and they give it to rats. And if it doesn't kill the rats, now you have a potential pharmaceutical drug. And he farms that out to the universities, to the PIs. The PIs, there's 10,000 of them around the world. They are principal investigators for the pharmaceutical industry. These are the most powerful doctors in the world. These are the guys who run the departments at the medical school. They're the ones who do the testing for the pharmaceutical industry of new drugs. So they do the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial. Tony Fauci gives his molecule to those guys, and they'll do the phase 1 trial where they recruit like a small number of humans, maybe 100. Fauci gives that to scientists about $15,000 to $20,000 for each recruit. The university skims off half of that money. The university is now addicted to Tony Fauci. And then they go through phase 2 trials and the same thing, but now a lot of people, so it's hundreds of millions that are pouring into that program. And then phase 3 trial, usually they bring a pharmaceutical company in at that point to share the costs. The pharmaceutical company takes part of the patent. Tony Fauci can take part of the patent for his agency. He can distribute patent rights to loyal people who work for him, so they get $150,000 a year for life from royalties. There's 4 people of his top deputies who own patent rights on the Moderna vaccine. So his guys are getting personally rich. They're paying their mortgage. They're buying their fishing boats as long as they can get that vaccine on the market. So he has a huge incentive. He's not a regulator. He is a subsidiary of the pharmaceutical industry. And then the university takes part of the patent and the PI takes part. So everybody now is getting filthy rich. And Tony Fauci, then it comes back to him and he controls FDA and he then gets it approved by FDA. So between 2009 and 2016, there were about 200 drugs that were approved by FDA that all came through Tony Fauci's shop. he doesn't do public health. He's an incubator for the pharmaceutical industry. And, and his big wet dream for his entire life has been getting a vaccine that he can force the entire globe to purchase. And, that sounds maybe crazy or paranoid to people, but read my book and you'll see that I I show exactly how his psyche and how his approach developed over time with hard facts, not speculation. If people who care what's happening today, I would urge them to buy the book. 100% of my profits go to Children's Health Defense, so you're supporting the movement by buying it, but also we need to get it. If we get 10,000 pre-sales on Amazon, and we have about 4,000 now, it will all automatically become a New York Times bestseller. And then there's a whole cascading effect of things that happen. It goes to the front of the bookstores. It appears in the airport bookstores, and it's a way of fighting back against this, this combination that's trying to take everything that means something to Americans.
Wow. And what's the name of your book?
It's called The Real Tony Fauci, and it's called Bill Gates. The subtitle is Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health.
Now, I know we're running out of time, Bob, but I want to just ask one quick question. How do you understand the Bill Gates connection into all this? I understand.
It's a complex issue because Gates began, Gates called Fauci in 2000, and just after the New Year's, asked him to come out to his $147 million mansion in Seattle. And they sat down together in Gates' library, and Gates proposed a partnership with Fauci. And the partnership was essentially to vaccinate the world with as many vaccines as possible and to abolish infectious disease. The problem is that neither of them actually looks at whether their vaccines are improving public health, because you can abolish measles or diphtheria with vaccines, but are the children actually living longer? Are they actually healthy? And the vaccines are exempt from the safety testing. And it's the only medical product or medical device that never has to go through a preclinical randomized placebo test. Below 70, Tony Fauci keeps saying, I'm not going to let anybody use ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, which we know are life-saving. They haven't gone through randomized placebo trials, but none of the vaccines on the schedule have ever gone through randomized placebo trials in pre-licensing testing. So I'll just tell you one story. The most popular vaccine in the world is the DTP vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. It was banned. It was discontinued in this country in the 80s because it was causing brain injuries in 1 out of every 300 kids. It was even earlier, the Europeans stopped using it, but Bill Gates is giving it to 161 million African children a year. And he gets, he puts in a little money, and then he gets all the international agencies and countries to put in money to support his vaccine vision. And the Danish government, he asked them to put money in, and they said, well, we want to actually see whether kids who get this vaccine are actually healthier. We know it stops diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. Does it actually improve public health? And so they sent the best team in the world. They funded this. They funded the program, the study with the Staten Serum Institute of Denmark, which is one of the biggest vaccine companies in the world. And they got the best scientists, Stephen Morgensen and Peter A. Abey, who is like a deity and African pro-vaccine guys. They went and they actually looked at 30 years of data. And what they found was that girls who got this vaccine had 10 times the death rate over the next 2 months as children who did not get. I mean, as children who did not get it. Vaccinated girls were 10 times more likely to die than unvaccinated, but the girls were dying of things nobody had ever associated with the vaccine. So nobody ever looked at them. Nobody ever noticed this. They were dying mainly of pneumonia, of pulmonary injuries, upper respiratory infections, of bilharzia, anemia, sepsis, dysentery, a whole range of diseases. And nobody ever looked and said, it's only the vaccinated girls who are dying. And the vaccine was protecting those girls against diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, but it had ruined their immune systems, and it made them much more susceptible to other diseases. And that is the same thing today that we need to worry about with the, with the lack of testing that was done by these rush to market COVID vaccines. All those vaccines may protect people from COVID, but we don't know what they're doing long-term in terms of ruining our immune systems to make us more susceptible to other illnesses. And, there's a series of studies that have been done by the Cochrane Collaboration and the British Medical Journal on the flu vaccine, meta-analyses. And what they found is that people who get the flu vaccine are immune against that strain of flu, but they're 6 times more likely than unvaccinated people to get non-flu infections. Well, the vaccine has a paradoxical effect. Yes, it can protect you against that illness, but it's not making you healthier. It's making you much, much sicker. So, and those are things people ought to be able to evaluate. We ought to be able to debate. We ought to be able to ask these questions. And that's not happening.
Well, thank you. And I guess that leads to a final question to you. In light of everything that you just said, in light of the extraordinary pressure through the media and the government to get vaccines, in light of the fact that in some places you can't travel, in some places you can't enter, what's your advice to people as they consider whether to get vaccinated or not, whether they consider to travel or not? I mean, how would you advise the 20, 30,000 people watching this program right now?
Well, I don't give
navigate.
I don't give people medical advice, and anybody who gives a broad advice like that, I would not trust them that much, because the advice would be different for every age cohort, and it would be different depending on what your comorbidities. You have to assess your risk from coronavirus and measure that against your risk from the vaccines. And for older people, we really don't know what their risks from the vaccine are. We know that they have a high risk from coronavirus. So I think that they may be more likely to get protection from the vaccine and a beneficial effect. I will say this: I think that the evidence that young people should be vaccinated is not there, and that it really is malpractice to be vaccinating somebody who is under 30 unless they're extremely obese. I think it's that the risk to them, the Lancet suggested an article that said the risk of death to children who are between 4 and 16 years old is 1.6 per million. And I can guarantee you that the vaccine will kill more people than that, for sure. We know that from the clinical trials, and we're seeing the deaths now. We're seeing these more deaths. Half the deaths that have been caused by vaccines on the VAERS system since 1986 have been caused in the last 6 months by the COVID vaccine. It's the most deadly vaccine that we've ever seen. And it tends to kill people who have much more robust immune systems. So it kills young people. And, I'm talking to parents every day whose kids are paralyzed, hospitalized, their lives wrecked by this vaccine. And it's really, it's malpractice. And unfortunately, we have public health agencies, the CDC, who are covering up those injuries. We have the press who is not reporting them. And it's very disturbing, but I don't think any case can be made at this point for a young person getting vaccinated. And in fact, the WHO has just said the same thing I did. They posted now on their website that this vaccine should not be given to children yesterday, in fact.
Well, Robert Kennedy, everyone, on an issue of deep import to all of us, both at the level of democracy and at the level of a public health. And so I really want to thank you for illuminating us today. And I recommend going to Children's Health Defense, the organization of which Bob Kennedy is the chairman. His new book, The Real Anthony Fauci, please order it so that we can support just simply getting the truth out. And whether you agree with the particulars of what he's saying or not, the essence of democracy is debate and the free exchange of information. So I recommend that book, which you can order online and presumably from the Children's Health Defense website. So thank you.
Get out on Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. And then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to continue our commemoration of Unity Week. And we're meeting a half hour earlier. And Rick has put the link in the chat box. And also, you'll be receiving an email, those of you who are registered on Humanity Rising, for that earlier start. It will include Jane Goodall and various notables talking to youth around the world. So once again, thank you, Bob. This has been splendid. You have an encyclopedic mind, my friend, and I salute you. It's a good education for all of us. All right, everyone. Bye for now. See you tomorrow here on Humanity Rising.
Thank you, Jim.
Hey, we should be in touch.
Please stay in touch.
Yeah. I want to see how we can support your book because it's so important.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Jim.
All right, be well.